Hello, my name is Mary Kelley, and I am a professional development facilitator for Activate Learning. Today, we are going to examine how we can use a driving question board to move students from learning about science to figuring out science. So what will we do today? In this session, we will examine how teachers can use a driving question board to help students make sense of the natural and designed world by engaging in science and engineering practices, specifically the practice of questioning. For many years, it has been a goal of science reforms to move from students as passive recipients of knowledge to classrooms in which students are active participants in generating knowledge. In other words, to shift students from just learning science to figuring out science to help them make sense of the world. This sense-making is the process in which a learner actively engages with the natural world, wonders about it, and develops and tests ideas with peers and the teacher. So, what is a driving question board, and how does it help us achieve this goal? The driving question board begins with a driving question. The driving question is the question you pose to students in order to get them to investigate a problem or a process. It is the overarching question of the unit. The driving question is an open-ended inquiry that guides students' thinking and learning in a unit. As each unit progresses, the phenomena, investigations, discussions, readings, and writing activities support students in learning content that moves them closer to being able to answer the driving question. To organize the unit, the driving question is displayed on a driving question board, which can be a bulletin board or a large area on a wall. The driving question board is a tool used throughout the unit to focus students' attention, record what they have learned, and show students where they have been and the direction they are going. The driving question board serves as a visual reference that remains in place throughout the unit. Lesson plans typically guide the teacher in their use. Although the teacher maintains the driving question board, because it functions as a shared space to represent learning, students might also contribute regularly to the display. Each lesson addresses a component of the unit's driving question, supporting students in making sense of science content and determining which part of a question they can answer and which they still need to investigate. Thus, new lessons are motivated in part by what questions still need to be addressed. The visual display supports teachers and students in tracking and organizing ideas along the way. Each unit invites students to post their own original questions on the driving question board. As they think of new questions at any time during the unit, students write those questions on sticky notes and add them to the class driving question board. Across a unit, the driving question board will come to include the unit-specified question and sub-questions, as well as student questions, including drawings, photographs, artifacts, objects, and sample student work. The driving question board will serve as a focal reference, helpful to all, but especially important for students for whom visual representations aid in their learning, such as connecting new ideas to previous ideas. The driving question board will look slightly different in every classroom, depending on the wall space and the configuration of the classroom. So let's experience a driving question board within the context of a physical science unit in the iQuest Middle School Science program. The unit's driving question is its title, How Will It Move? The entire unit is built around this question. All of the discussions, investigations, science readings, and writing activities all relate to this question. The goal is for students to be able to answer the driving question at the end of the unit. We want students to figure out in this unit ways to know in advance, for many scenarios, if something will move, and if so, how will it move? At the end of this unit, students will be able to explain what they need to do in order to make something move the way they want it to. In the next few weeks, students investigate the nature of motion in order to develop a full understanding of how and why things move the way they do. As I said, the ultimate goal will be to answer the driving question: how will it move? Since an object's motion can be very simple or very complex, students should not expect there to be a simple answer to the driving question. The driving question board helps students build toward the performance expectations aligned with this unit. Asking questions is one of the scientific and engineering practices. A key focus of current science education is developing systems of explanatory ideas rather than isolated facts. Again, we are shifting our classrooms from learning about to figuring out. The goal is to explain something in the world that occurs, a phenomenon, and to figure out and reach consensus on how and why it works the way it does. Asking questions helps students figure out what needs to change, where the class needs to go next in figuring out how and why something works the way it does in the world. This unit is launched by having students experience an anchoring phenomenon. Phenomena are natural events that occur in the world that we can use our science knowledge to explain. Why is it important to begin with an anchoring phenomenon? Well, there are many important reasons, but the most important reason is that it piques students' interest in the unit. And we know that student interest is key to learning. Interested students are more motivated to engage in a thoughtful, mind-on way. Initially, students explore a magnetic cannon that behaves in a surprising, unpredictable manner. Students then generate questions about the device itself, the driving question, and forces, motion, and energy in general. These questions are organized into a driving question board that guides the lessons throughout the unit. Much of this unit will be spent using the anchoring phenomenon of the magnetic cannon as a context for learning about force, motion, and energy. Each learning set contributes crucial pieces of information needed to explain how the magnetic cannon works. If we were doing this in a classroom with students, each group would have the necessary materials to build the magnetic cannon. Before students begin the activity, they make a prediction as to what will happen when the ball hits the magnets. The teacher should probe the group as to why they make the predictions they did. Then students place the loose steel ball on the rail on the side of the magnet. Someone gently taps the steel ball so that it rolls very slowly to the magnets. One of the best parts of this activity is that it allows students to play with the cannon and observe what happens. The group should be encouraged to experiment with the cannon. Some questions that commonly come up in discussions while students are experimenting with the magnetic cannon are, did it make a difference whether 1, 2, or 3 steel balls were attached to the magnets? Did it make a difference if I used 1 or 2 magnets? Since many of us are in stages of remote learning now, Activate Learning has made a video for every activity that we do, knowing full well that students who are working at home may not have the necessary materials to complete any kind of an activity or an anchoring phenomenon. Here is a quick short video of the magnetic cannon and how it looks when operating in the classroom. So for students at home who may not be able to complete this activity, there is a video that will help them to see what is indeed the anchoring phenomenon. The driving question board should be structured around the sub-questions in the unit: starting and stopping motion, changing and describing motion, the relationship between forces and energy, Students' questions should be categorized according to these three subjects. List the categories on the board with room for students to place their sticky notes. If students struggle to generate questions, discuss the categories briefly and provide a sample question that falls under one of the categories. Once each group has placed their sticky notes on the driving question board, read each question aloud and agree on category placement. If disagreement arises, encourage students to discuss their ideas. This activity enables the class to become familiar with all the questions and supports students in learning to participate in discussion and debate in a respectful manner. Some of the questions that students raise will not fit into any of the three categories used to organize the driving question board. Such questions may be placed in a designated space called a parking lot. Note the section in the lower right-hand corner is the parking lot. The teacher has the flexibility to use students' own original questions in any number of ways suited to his or her students. One way is to use these questions that may not fit under any of the categories by placing them in the parking lot and then assigning question-answering projects to the groups to advance students who can handle the additional work associated with this task, or to students whose interest in a particular question is intense. Such questions may be assigned to students as an ongoing individual project that they complete using various resources. Such projects enable students who benefit from going beyond the unit to do so independently. With the teacher's discretion, projects for advanced students might come from such work, requiring use of multiple resources with varied text complexity. These questions may be assigned to students as an ongoing project that they need to complete by the end of the unit or by the end of the learning set using resources outside of the classroom. After students have experimented with the magnetic cannon and have begun generating questions, a class discussion is held to elicit their initial reactions. Asking questions, investigating phenomena, collecting data, and trying to figure these things out are important to iQuest and to all science. So have students generate questions about the magnetic cannon or about what makes anything move the way it does. Prompt students, if needed, to think about other things that move. Post questions on the driving question board now and throughout the unit to guide investigations and engage students in figuring out answers to their own questions. Some sample questions or typical questions that students might ask after experimenting with the magnetic cannon include these. Initially, the anchoring phenomena prompts students to ask questions about things they wonder about. Even their most offbeat questions show interest in something. So encourage all questions, even those offbeat ones. The parking lot is a good place to put some questions that may be off topic, but you still want to show respect to the student by honoring their question. After students have come up with their initial questions individually, they should then discuss their questions in a group of 4 and decide on questions that they will want to share. Each group should have a set of sticky notes on which to record their questions. Once students have finished writing questions, they should decide as a group which category each of their questions belongs in, and one student from each group should post a question in the appropriate category. Some groups may be unsure where their questions go. Encourage discussion and class decisions. Designate a parking lot for questions that do not clearly fit any of these 3 categories. I'd like to share a strategy that we use for helping students share their questions with the entire class. The first person who shares their question begins by saying, "I wondered," "I asked," and then stating their question. Once they've read the question out loud, they are asked to place their Post-it anywhere on the driving question board. And now here's where it gets tricky, because the second person to share a question needs to respond to the person who asked a question before them. And this will be the way it follows for the rest of the discussion. Anytime a student shares a question, they have to respond to the question that was just asked before them. And they can begin by asking their question by saying, either I had a similar question to his or hers, I asked, whatever the question is, or if their question is different, they would start by saying, I asked, which is different because, and then they will place it. This strategy has proven to be effective for helping students to listen to the questions of the students who went before them and to learn not just from the teacher, but from other students as well. When you launch a unit and you use the anchoring phenomena and the driving question in ways that pique student interest, you stand the best chance that students will become motivated to engage in learning. Here's an example of what a driving question board for this unit would look like. These questions will serve as a basis for the activities students will work on in the unit. Much of this unit will be devoted to understanding how the magnetic cannon worked and how things involving forces, motion, and energy work. So what does the driving question board look like? It's very dependent on the space you have in your classroom. Sometimes teachers have to get creative. My favorite driving question board is the one in the lower left-hand corner. The teacher had several sections of the same science class and very little room in her classroom. So she bought a wardrobe rack and hung driving question boards on hangers. Each class had a different driving question board on chart paper. When that class came in, she simply picked up the hanger and moved it to the front of the wardrobe rack. So the driving questions look different depending upon your classroom. During these days of remote learning, you might consider creating a virtual driving question board, in which case your driving question board might look more like this. You can develop a driving question board remotely with students by using apps like Padlet or Google Jamboard. These sites are free and are ways to set up a driving question board online. You might have some different apps that you use. At any rate, using anything that is a virtual whiteboard will help you set up a driving question board remotely. So just to review what we just did in this lesson, we had students experience an anchoring phenomena, the magnetic cannon. This anchoring phenomena raised a central question that will drive students to do and to figure out for the remainder of the unit. The anchoring phenomenon also raises lots of other questions from students that are accounted for using the driving question board and used as the entry point into investigations that come later. In the next lesson in this unit, students continue by experimenting with the Newton's cradle in groups. Students will follow up with a reading about Newton's cradle. After the reading, the teacher will help students flesh out their initial questions and add new questions to the driving question board. Students should be reminded of what they are trying to figure out, how things move. They should be encouraged to think about how and why questions. So here is where we are at in this unit. We are still following the driving question board routine. By looking at this graphic of the driving question board routine, you can see how the questions developed after the anchoring phenomena led to the understanding of the content and one of the first scientific principles of this unit. So, how often should you revisit the driving question board? Whenever students have new questions, we should add them to the driving question board. It's best to develop a routine. So anytime students think of new questions, they should be added. At the end of lessons, have students record notes about anything they have done or learned that might help them answer the driving question. Revisit the driving question board with students in each lesson. Refer to it often. Point to artifacts displayed on it as a reminder of previous activities or understandings. Post on it summaries of scientific principles, as well as artifacts students create that relate to specific questions. All of these can be put on the driving question board, including models and data tables developed as a class, or any other visual representation of concepts students have learned already. The important thing is to make using the driving question board a routine. Revisit it often. Many times after teachers have used a driving question board for a while, they often ask, how do I lift student questions up from phenomenon-specific questions to unit-level questions? It is sometimes a struggle to help students ask broader, more lesson-focused questions. Although we have often heard that there is no such thing as a stupid question, not all questions have the same value, especially when we are using them in inquiry investigations. We want students to ask questions that will help them construct meaning and further the investigation along. So I would like to address this challenge by discussing 3 aspects of the scientific practice of asking questions: the importance of asking questions in science, what questioning looks like in the classroom, and the key role of the teacher. The development in the skill of asking questions will be key to moving students' questions from what happened to how and why something happened and takes place over time. Keep these key features of asking questions in mind as you develop a driving question board with your students. Things to remember: what is the questioning practice not? The questioning practice is not about teachers asking vocabulary definitions of science terms. It is not about asking factual yes and no questions. The questioning practice is not about students asking the teacher to clarify when they misunderstand ideas or directions. The questioning practice is not just the first step in the science unit. It goes beyond asking, what do you want to know about the topic? And finally, the questioning practice is not a form of a trivia game. If students can simply search online for an answer, then it's not an interesting question for investigation. So how do we encourage students to ask questions beyond the initial activity? You may want to consider a mini lesson on how to ask good questions. Sometimes students need direct instruction in how do I ask a question that is meaningful and deep, that really gets to the how or the why, not just the what. The key role of the teacher cannot be understated. Note that although the goal of the practice is for students to generate questions about the explanatory stories behind phenomena, the teacher's role is key in asking the kinds of probing questions that support students in thinking more deeply and wondering about things that they take for granted. Teachers play a critical role in the knowledge building work. By asking questions of students to help them refine or deepen their own question, teachers can help students construct new questions that are worth investigating. Take a look at the chart to see what some of the issue with questions are. A lack of anything about the phenomena, the question might lack evidence, the question might lack a how or a why account. Through discussion and probing with students, the teacher can help them to turn their weak questions into revised questions. What kind of questions should you be asking as a teacher? Here are some suggestions for things that you can do to help improve student questions. You can ask students to flesh out their questions so that the class can agree on what they are trying to figure out. You should encourage students to think of how and why questions that they might be able to investigate. Ask students, how can you explain your observations? Also suggest questions yourself about what happened. Even though we say that the driving question board is student-centered, that means that the teacher can't be involved in it. Many times the teacher wondering out loud with the student not only models good questioning and investigating behavior, but it can be a vehicle for adding questions that are deep and meaningful that will move the learning along. And finally, model how to extract questions from observations of the phenomena. Student questions can be improved by the teacher wandering along with the students and asking her own questions, by creating a classroom climate in which all students take responsibility for knowledge building. It's important that the teacher encourage participation and celebrate questions. Something as simple as responding to a student by saying, "Hey, that's a great question. You made me think with that one," can go a long way in encouraging further involvement with the questioning practice. Some questions that teachers often ask once they've started with the driving question board: what if I got lost with it and too much time has passed since I last revisited the driving question board? Don't just drop it. Continue. Use it as a time to reflect on what you've done and learned and pick up the driving question board again. Review what's up there already and start anew with a new lesson or a new unit. What are some examples of student learning that we could post? There are all sorts of things. Even Xeroxing copies of some student work that's especially good. If you've agreed on a model or a consensus model, posting that. Some teachers have added photographs of students working, of investigations that are ongoing, and artifacts from those investigations. All of these visual representations help students to understand where have we been and where are we going. Teachers often wonder, what if I teach five classes? Do I need 5 driving question boards? No, probably not. Most middle school classrooms don't have enough room for 5 driving question boards. So teachers frequently have one board that reflects the work of all of their classes, updating it at the end of the day themselves or having a student update for them. Notice in the picture, there are multiple colors of Post-it notes. Teachers with many sections of the same class will often assign one class a color of Post-it notes. So for example, first period will put their questions on blue Post-it notes. Second period might use yellow Post-it notes. Very quickly, students come to understand that the color of the Post-it note reflects the questions asked by their class, and they will focus on those and tune out the others. This is a common response to, what do I do if I teach many classes? How do I start using the driving question board? The very first thing you need to do is make sure that your driving question board is set up and visible to students. If you are organizing your driving question board using sub-questions, those should be posted from the beginning. The driving question should be posted in the middle, also from day one. In this case, our driving question was, how will it move? You noted that that question was in the center of the driving question board. After students have experienced the anchoring phenomena for the unit, they've made some observations, they begin to pose questions. And these questions should be posted on the driving question board. They should put one question per sticky note, and they should post it on the board under the category that they think it best belongs in. Some guidelines for the driving question board: make sure that the students see that the driving question board is posted on the wall or on the bulletin board as soon as the unit begins. Make sure also that everyone can see it, that it's clear and it's in a place where students have access. At the start of a new learning set, select students' questions related to the topic that organizes it and arrange them under that question. And finally, make sure you keep a parking lot. It's a great place for students to post questions that have gone beyond the scope of the unit or may not necessarily be related to the topic. So the driving question board, just to recap, it's a visual reference. It focuses students' attention. It records what they have learned. It shows where they have been and where they are going. It promotes authentic assessments. A common formative assessment is for teachers to take a driving question or a question off the driving question board and share it with the class by saying something like, you know, I think we have answered this question already. I think we figured this out. I'd like everybody to write 3 or 4 sentences explaining the answer to this question because we've already figured this one out. It's a powerful, authentic assessment tool. So I hope that you will decide to use a driving question board in your classroom. On behalf of Activate Learning, thank you for spending time with me today.